From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel, and we are sorting through the results of another extraordinary election night. As they say, that's why we play the games when there's an upset, and that's why we count the votes in election night. One of the storylines I've been following and I think is notable is that the Democrats had a strategy that was certainly cynical, given all their worries and fretting about democracy and the threat to it. But that strategy, nonetheless, seems to have worked. And that strategy was to spend heavily in several races to help nominate mega Republican candidates, because their theory was that those candidates would be easier to beat. Don Bolduc in New Hampshire being one of them. I think John Gibbs in Grand Rapids District defeated Peter Meyer, the representative that voted for Trump's impeachment. And as I look at the results so far, Kyle, every single one of those candidates lost that the Democrats helped nominate. So their strategy worked.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating point because these are places where Democrats and Donald Trump were pulling in the same direction in the Republican primary. The one thing that I would add is that, again, this is why we play the game, but looking at some of the polling before the election, it was not clear that was going to be the case. Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, for example, there were a few polls that showed him ahead. I think in the last Real Clear Politics average, he was only behind by maybe a point or two. And so if you had polling error in Democrats' favor, you could well imagine an election night where we end up with Senator Bolduc, and Republicans have many occasions over the next 6 years to remind Democrats that they helped him get the nomination. And so it is a fascinating dynamic in some of these primaries as Trump was meddling in them. The one thing on abortion that I would add to what Kim said is there were 5 states where there were ballot initiatives or referenda on abortion, and all of them, according to the latest results, the pro-choice, the pro-abortion rights side is winning. There's one in Montana that I think has not been called yet, but the pro-abortion side is up by about 5 points as of the latest vote tallies. And what I think is notable about this is, to the point that Kim made about Republicans finding a message on this, a moderate message on this, that will resonate with voters. I think this is just the beginning, because there's a history of parties using ballot initiatives, using referendums as a way to juice turnout, even in states where, like California, where pro-choice laws are already the law of the land. They want to get a pro-choice referendum on the ballot to get people out to the polls to help in some of those House districts that are maybe marginal. And so we have 5 on the ballot this year, and in 2024, it could be more than that.
Well, I had a Republican senator who's pro-life point out to me today that, wait a minute, don't blame abortion too much for this, because governors who had supported restrictions on abortion rights survived quite comfortably. Republicans, Ron DeSantis being one of them, Brian Kemp another, I think Kim Reynolds in Iowa. A lot of them did just fine. So abortion wasn't the terrible issue for Republicans that some say. I'm not sure I buy that completely, because your results, Kyle, in those referenda certainly show that when it's put on the ballot as a yes or no proposition, voters tend to go to the pro-choice direction. And I think it calls for, as Kim suggested, some moderation to get closer to Republicans in the post-Roe v. Wade world, to where the voters are, which is not a ban, but reasonable restrictions as well. I pointed out the governors, Kim, and, Republican governors who incumbents did well. Kim Reynolds won easily. Chris Sununu won easily. Brian Kemp won easily. DeWine won easily. And, of course, Ron DeSantis. Let's listen to Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, on his victory.
Thanks to the overwhelming support of the people of Florida, we not only won election, we have rewritten the political map. Thank you for honoring us with a win for the ages.
Well, modesty is not his middle name, Kim, but he has bragging rights. He won by nearly 20 points. He won Miami-Dade for the first time for a Republican, Miami-Dade County, heavily Hispanic county, for the first time since Jeb Bush's reelection in 2002. He also won Osceola County, which is south of Orlando, which is heavily Puerto Rican. As we know in New York, Puerto Ricans don't vote for Republicans. It's a little different in Florida. They do. But I think Rick Scott got a lot of those votes too. But this is just an overwhelming performance by DeSantis, vindicating how he handled the pandemic, I think, keeping the state open earlier, pushing to open schools, keeping kids in school for many more months than many states across the country. What do you make of, first of all, these governors governors, and then DeSantis.
Yeah, so there was a red wave in some places, and I think that that's really notable. It goes back to the Mitch McConnell point. Candidate quality really does matter. And that to me is the biggest message of everything on Tuesday. It doesn't surprise me that Sununu and DeWine and Kemp all won election easily because they had proven track records of managing their states well, and voters rewarded them for that. And the same with DeSantis. Two numbers I would point out. In 2018, Ron DeSantis won Florida by fewer than 34,000 votes. As of now, he was leading by nearly 1.5 million. And there's still some vote to be counted, but that is an extraordinary shift. And I agree with you. It has to do with having kept the state open. It has to do with educational choice, something that really has kept minority voters on his side and expanded his depth among those voters. I think that part of this win is also the very effective management that the state of Florida showed under DeSantis' leadership after the recent hurricane. You know, there were some wonderful viral clips going around of Democrats saying, I'm a Democrat, but I'm voting for Ron DeSantis simply because he got the gas into my town on time. You know, voters really appreciate that stuff. And we'll see where he goes with this. I kind of listened to that speech a little bit, Paul, last night as maybe not just a victory speech, but a toe in the water of, I want to introduce myself to the nation as a possible presidential contender. But by the way, if he was going to choose a forum to do that, last night was a pretty good one.
I was watching the results for when DeSantis gave that speech with a colleague of longstanding who knows politics and turned to me and said, he's running. He meant running for president. And that's the way it sounded to me. Now I think he needs to polish that address a little bit much and drop what I call the vertical pronoun, which is the references to I, as opposed to we, if you're going to rally and create a movement. But
that really stuck out to me, by the way, Paul. Like there was that bit at the end, he was like, I did this and I did this. And I was like, why are you just not saying we?
Yeah, that's a little bit of the DeSantis personality, and I think it's potential vulnerability if he does run. But that's for another day. Kyle, I want to talk about the Democrats and if there's any lessons here from the election for them, any introspection required, because I think they're going to say with some justification, this was not a repudiation of our agenda. This was not a rejection of our agenda. It was a typical midterm, even a little bit better than that from our point of view with owning the party in the White House. And we did just fine. Yeah, we might lose the House by a few seats, but poised in 2 more years to take it back because the majority will be so narrow. And if they hold the Senate, we'll be able to run through all of the Biden nominees that we want and stick with our agenda. But do you think, looking at the results, there's anything they ought to think about 2 or 3 times?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. One is the issue polling, where people are very concerned about inflation. They're very concerned about crime, and elections that they won that were supposed to be blowouts were not necessarily blowouts. And I would point to the New York gubernatorial race, where Kathy Hochul is the winner over Lee Zeldin. But boy, that was closer than was comfortable for her. And she seemed to ignore the issues that were on voters' minds until very late in the game. And so the issue polling, I think, is one. And the second thing would be just the flip side of the conversation we've been having about President Trump. I think Democrats, President Biden, people in the White House ought to look at the Senate map and think, boy, we really dodged a bullet there in Pennsylvania and maybe in Georgia and in Arizona potentially, because Trump got involved in these primaries and nominated candidates who had trouble winning. But I don't think that's a endorsement of the Democratic agenda. And I still think that President Biden would be well served by doing what he promised on the campaign trail in 2020 and trying to unite the country, trying to pivot back toward the middle. And, you know, as we've discussed on this show, get some American energy going and get some kind of immigration deal done with the Republican House, if that's what we end up having, and try to sell himself as the centrist that he has claimed to be.
Just to put a number on your point about Lee Zeldin and Kathy Hochul in New York, Zeldin, last count, was at 47% with something like 1 million votes left to be cast. So the base has been called for. Hochul, Zeldin has not conceded yet, but that is much closer. And of course, the fact that Zeldin did so well and Hochul so poorly relative to previous Democratic candidates here helped, I think, to make vulnerable some of the Democratic House members who were running and as Kim suggested, could help Republicans pick up seats. Kim, I'm going to give you the last word, but on the Joe Biden point, 67% of the voters said they don't want him to run again in the exit polls. Not a resounding endorsement.
That's one way to put it. Yeah, in addition to seeing how some of these last races are called, this is going to be the fascinating guessing game over the next couple of weeks, is how much pressure now mounts on Joe Biden to get out of the way and make room. I can promise you, even though Democrats had a little bit better night, that now that the midterms are over, those calls are going to start coming anonymously via the press. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Joe Biden. And similarly, this supposedly, teaser announcement Donald Trump was going to make on the 15th, I believe that was the latest date he floated. If he's really thinking about announcing for the presidency in light of these results, he might want to rethink again, but I guess we'll find out what his plans are soon.
Kim, he would always be better taking your advice, but unfortunately, he often takes his own. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back the rest of this week trying to make sense of the results of this fascinating election and its consequences for the future of American politics and governance. Thanks for listening.